Hey guys, Tom here. Just a heads up on the guest audio channel. We had a few technical problems, so there's a couple places during the show where it gets a little difficult to hear every word that he's saying. I think overall you can still understand the point he's trying to make, so hopefully it's not too bad. I know it's not the best listening, but we tried to do what we could to edit it together and make it listenable. So I hope you still enjoy the show, and here we go. Hello everybody, welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here, and I'm joined by Donald as usual, and we are also joined today by our friend Alex, and we're going to be talking today about climate change and some of the problems with the discourse in climate change, around climate change, particularly on the activist side in terms of political solutions and things like that. So Alex, why don't you introduce some of your ideas here?
Hi. Well, I want to start out by saying I'm not a climate expert. You know, I work basically in manual labor, and I don't really have any scientific background. But what I would describe myself as, I'm basically an informed layman. I read a lot about this stuff. You know, I'm one of the only people I know that actually reads the IPCC reports from cover to cover, and I just generally read a lot about it. It's been an interest of mine for a long time, and yeah, as you said, I've kind of noticed some problems the way people talk about this now. You know, I've kind of always been concerned about these issues. You know, I grew up, my parents were kind of hippies, and I always thought that all this climate change stuff was important. But I really only started getting super concerned about it more recently. You know, it's kind of embarrassing. I read this Rizone post by a guy named Shenong. Do you guys remember that? And he kind of paints this very, very bleak picture of what climate change is going to do. And it's really convincing. You know, I still think people should probably go back and read that. I think it's a neat kind of article or post or however you put it.
Yeah, I mean, that's our friend Mike who did the previous episode on climate change with us and stuff. So
yeah, and that guy kind of woke me up to this stuff, and I got really concerned for a very long time about, you know, not just my future, but the future of the world in general. And I went down a rabbit hole and just started reading so much stuff about this. And I basically became what I'd call a catastrophe. I thought, you know, if climate change, even if it isn't going to kill everybody or destroy civilization, it's at the very least going to be an epic-defining event. It's going to change everything. It's going to require us to totally reorder society. But as I got more into it, I started branching out and reading stuff that was not really from this very radical, depressing frame. I started reading, you know, more mainstream climate science, the IPCC, and even these people that are kind of like the opposite of catastrophism. The eco-modernists. We read an article from one of those guys for this episode.
Right. Yeah.
And they're more like, you know, they're totally pro-technology, we can solve this kind of stuff. And just getting these different perspectives, I discovered that my old views were just unsustainable. You know, I think that I'm still really concerned about climate change as a problem, as something that we really have to deal with and that is going to create a whole lot of havoc. But I'm not so certain anymore that it is really the biggest problem that we're facing. I think it's more kind of interlinked with a whole bunch of other problems that already exist. And I wouldn't necessarily say I'm an optimist. In some ways, I'm extremely pessimistic. But beyond just it not being just a totally civilization-defining problem, I just kind of discovered that it was a much bigger and more complex and difficult problem than I previously realized. I think that there's a lot of serious problems with the mainstream approach, you know, the kind of stuff that you talked about last time with Mike, but I think there's also problems with the more radical approaches. The approaches you're going to get talking with environmentalists, activists.
Okay, so Do you have maybe some specific examples or something that you could point to?
Yeah, well, I'll start out a little more general. I think
Okay.
that environmentalists they're kind of wedded to this Malthusian vision of the future where climate change just has to totally overwhelm everything. And this just distorts the view of the science, the view of the causes of climate change. Like, obviously, carbon causes it, but like more societal causes of it, as well as the solutions that we have. And I kind of think that this view, it might actually be worse than the mainstream.
Hmm.
You know, the IPCC and mainstream climate scientists, I think that they understand climate change a lot better than the kind of activists you'll get. And even people that are not like really out there like George Monbiot, or well, I'd say that would be a good example, but I think that people really think that the only way that we're going to solve this stuff is by kind of either getting just blown over by it and it's going to make industrial civilization collapse or it's going to destroy the economy, or they think, we're going to have to like go back to some sort of earlier form of society. We're going to either have to go back to a much smaller economy, or we're going to have to, in the extreme cases, we're going to all have to go back to being subsistence farmers or hunter-gatherers. And I think that these things are really just sort of nonsense. I think that probably the way that you can get some sort of positive change out of this, we're going to have to kind of continue doing what we're doing, just without emitting so much carbon. That's really the only way that's going to work practically, and it's the only thing that's really desirable to get out of it.
Sure. Isn't that kind of the general idea that I don't know? I'm not as familiar with all this stuff. I don't know. I just don't read that much about it. But my impression is that people who are arguing, I don't know. I've actually never heard anyone argue for, like, in a serious way, to return back to some kind of previous subsistence farming style of economy. I don't know. I see that a little bit online with like goofy people on Twitter or something, but
Sure. I may be kind of overplaying that, but just like last week, I was listening to this interview with these guys who write for Jacobin, and they were on Doug Henwood's show. You ever listen to that?
I used to, yeah, like way back, yeah.
I forget their names right now, but they were basically like, well, how are we going to solve the issue of climate change agriculture? And the options they were giving were like, well, everybody's going to have to stop eating meat, and we're going to have to get away from industrial farming, and we're all going to, or maybe, I'm kind of overplaying it, but we're going to have to go, a lot more people are going to have to, we're going to kind of reverse some of the changes that we've done. We're going to go to small-scale farming, more people farming, without using, modern technology that's supposedly destroying the world. And I honestly see this stuff quite frequently. This is mainly the way that I see, these are the main solutions I see people promoting on the more radical activists. They generally think that the way you're going to do it is getting small, getting rid of technology, which is the problem, and, cutting out things, cutting down.
I think that at some level that's got to be like almost definitionally true when it comes to certain types of factory farming of meat and things like that. Like I think that there's some, I think it's one of these issues where I think you're onto something, but it's kind of like when an issue becomes kind of a big issue on the left, there's a tendency to frame things in a way that you can't go wrong by exaggerating sometimes, like there's kind of like a tendency to kind of anyone that kind of goes too far. And it's because there's this sense that going too far doesn't really matter because it's so far out from where the mainstream is in terms of the actual political mainstream. Like when you're talking about like people like Joe Biden and Donald Trump and stuff, that people think that that's safe in some ways to be wrong in the right direction, kind of thing. Like I think so. I think that's kind of where people are coming from sometimes when it comes to this. I mean, I also I think it's good that you're able to kind of dig into some of these reports and things like that. Many years ago, I took like courses on this kind of stuff, and it was interesting to me, and I kind of got into it a bit. But I still feel like I honestly, and I joke about this, but I really I feel like I am not in a position to make most of the policy decisions that might be involved in, like, I have like hunches about things, and I think that's really a lot of it for activist kind of left stuff. I think it's hunches about what would be nice. And I don't know if it actually resolves down into quantitative kind of things. Like, I don't know, like for me, like I don't understand how to or like organize a food system or something like that, right? Like I don't know the details about like fertilizer use and water use and all that kind of stuff. And that's one thing that does worry me when I see a lot of that kind of stuff getting into real details in left platforms and things like that, where it's one of those things where you know that a lot of the people that are deciding on this really have not. They are just saying, well, that sounds good. That sounds better than what is now. And I'm not sure that's actually a way to run. I mean, it's the way policy almost always works, but I don't know if that's actually how policy should be done, right? Like, I don't think that my hunch should determine, I don't know. So I don't know if you might want to respond to that. Like, do you see that kind of thinking as well, like with the exaggerations and stuff, and how that would, what would be
that makes a lot of sense to me.
To that, I don't know. Like, how could like what would, like, say there was, it doesn't have to be necessarily the DSA itself, but they recently they sort of made this their top priority right now. They said in their convention, and they said, they're an eco-socialist Green New Deal, which is supposed to be, I mean, it seemed to almost respond to the concerns that were in the article about not having large public works projects and stuff. Like, that kind of thinking is very much about, rebuilding the Tennessee Valley Authority and all that kind of stuff. Like, so, but as you said, it's also got that kind of thinking on the other end where it talks about, those kind of things about small scale production of food and all that kind of stuff, which doesn't seem coherent in a, Marxist sense or something like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with almost all of that, actually. And specifically on the DSA thing, the DSA thing is kind of a hodgepodge. And also, the way that these kind of people think about this stuff, there's kind of two wings, which is the guys I was talking about before, and then there's the people like Lee Phillips, who's also wrote for Jacobin. He wrote a book called Austerity Ecology, which I think is kind of a good primer on, maybe like a left eco-modernist perspective on how this stuff should get solved. And so you kind of have a mix of it. And I think that's really weird. I don't really know why they do it that way. I guess it's just consensus. We're going to try to put everything in.
Yeah.
But as you said, like, yeah, I think that you can't necessarily consider this stuff like policy, and you kind of have to do it in an aspirational way, and sometimes you're going to go too far. The problem that I have is that I think they're going in the wrong direction. Like, I don't think that going to small scale farms is ever going to work. I don't think that's a solution for the modern world. Something like 1% of the U.S. is involved in agriculture. And it's all big business. Even the small farmers are big business. They, if you have 50 acres, you're a millionaire. And I don't see a way that, you could say that maybe it would be good for the environment if we went back to small scale. I don't think that's even necessarily true. The small scale stuff uses a lot more land, for one thing. So if we were going to do that, we would have to expand the land that we use massively. Especially if you're really cutting down on fertilizer use, which is another thing they're talking about.
Yeah.
But it's not a way to feed a country with a population of hundreds of millions.
But I think that's true. But I mean, at some level, I know it's this is a national debate within the U.S., but climate change does have a sort of global aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do think of it in terms of technology across the world, there's a lot more farmers in places like, South and East Asia. And still, I mean, they've gotten rid of a lot of farmers in that kind of same developmental stagism kind of approach. But like I feel like there's still, I don't know. I feel like there's still sort of like reorganization processes that have to take place that aren't necessarily sort of this march towards centralization and scale. Like, I think there could be, I don't know. I mean, maybe this is like the pseudo-Maoist in me or something. Like, this idea that the rural development needs to be sort of more even and combined than just kind of, I mean, the United States has a very, very unique, in some ways, agricultural system compared to some other places. Like China still has a large number of people who do small scale farming, and I don't know. But I do. I mean, I do get the sense of what you're saying too. In sense, like I know a little bit more about Quebec, where I used to live, has a very kind of, it's a bit more left wing than the rest of Canada in some respects. And I mean, at least it has more like a left wing kind of base. And they have these kind of debates much more openly, I think, and in more detail than a lot of the like Anglo left in North America. And they do have like currents that are called like, degrowth currents, and
Right.
very explicitly saying the kind of things that you're worried about, like very explicitly saying, no, we have to, not just saying, I mean, it's pretty mainstream. Like RFK said stuff like this about, don't worry about the GDP as much and stuff, like it doesn't
Yeah.
measure quality of life and all that kind of stuff. But
And they have a point.
Yeah,
You have
yeah.
to admit they have a point. Even I
Yeah.
would say, even I would admit that, even though
Sure.
I take a different perspective.
Yeah, and I think that, yeah, I mean, I do think that kind of, I think there's like a mainstream version of that kind of makes a bit more sense. But I do have to admit that I do see that kind of trend where, but I mean, I think that might be just a effect of kind of the left in general, where the status quo seems so untenable to people in so many different ways that they look at a way of kind of rejecting the basis of it instead of just, I mean, I think the approach that you're kind of talking about is more in tune with the kind of Marxist tradition in some sense, because it talks about taking
It's developmental.
our existing society.
Yeah.
It takes our existing society and thinks of ways that it might change instead of thinking of a potential society that is wholly kind of like theoretical, and then we kind of adjust ourselves to it. So yeah.
I would definitely agree with that. Although I would say that I definitely think there's a good reason to, and a lot of potential to think about a totally transformed world.
Yeah.
I just don't think it, one where we're all a lot poorer and we're living as subsistence farmers is a really good vision.
Yeah.
I mean, as I said, I think that those people have a point, but a very conservative vision, I think, and I don't think it's one that's really adequate for the world that we're going to move forward to. Like, if we talk about worldwide, it's definitely true that the United States and developed economies in general have much less people working in agriculture. There's not really peasants or subsistence farmers, except for like a few people living on the dole. But yeah, there's more if you go outside. But almost every single one of those countries are moving out of that. Like, if you look at China, they've gone from, I think that it's majority urbanized. People have moved out of their subsistence farm, and the way that they've improved their lives is by urbanizing, by getting jobs outside of agriculture. And, this is true of India as well, to a lesser extent. Southeast Asia, again, same thing. And it's really, that is really just the way the world is. And it's going to be very, very hard to make any sort of program that's going to be able to get, not just people in the United States and Europe, back on the low tech, low energy. You got to get the whole world when it's moving in the completely opposite direction. And I don't really see a way to do it. I mean, these things do apply more to those countries, but those countries are moving out of that. And I think that by the end of the century, climate change aside, those societies are going to look a lot more like, you're going to have less people on the farm, and you're going to have more mechanized agriculture, more centralized, and so on. If there is potential for that kind of stuff, I think that it has to be justified basically based on its own merit. It can't be that we say that, we do know that all this stuff is causing problems. I think we have carbon emissions from agriculture. We have nitrogen waste from fertilizer that's eutrophying the ocean, causing algal blooms and stuff like that. But trying to go back to previous systems, I don't see it. I think even if we have a very catastrophic kind of climate change, that's not the way it's going to work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like an economist, Paul Samuelson, I think he said about growth economics that, kind of the 101 version of development economics is that growth is getting rid of farmers. Like that's kind of the, the 101 is that. And I thought, that's always kind of stuck in my mind. But I feel like, I don't know, I still like that idea of at least that you have to think of the communities that people live in beyond just that one role of farming. Like there's food production. That's one of the things that I do think is strong about ecology kind of thinking, is this idea of the relationship between the different moving parts, so that it's not just a focus on what makes sense in terms of market outcomes, because the market outcomes will tend towards not just that kind of food production, this industrial scale, but also we have to talk about like inequality. Like it skews towards making things that people who are well off can afford. It skews towards creating food crises for poorer people and things like that. So if you're gonna look at it from a system-wide angle, then you kind of have to worry about solutions to those things, and even just like basic equality things. Where I feel like, I don't know, I feel like there's some sort of, I don't know if it's like neoliberal or what the word to be used is, but this kind of deferral to the future of the solutions of inequality, where
well, I think that environmentalists they would kind of call that stuff productivism.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that are critics of productivism.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that can get into very weird areas, obviously, where you start critiquing production as almost like a literary thing too, and the worries about the effects on the soul and all that kind of stuff. But I don't know. I do think that there's something there though, that about the interconnection of parts, and not just focusing on the best technology in a situation, but also like its social components as well, I guess. I don't know. Yeah.
Sure. Again, I agree with most of that. I think that is something that we have to consider. And especially the equity stuff. Like we certainly have to consider the way that these agricultural and larger societal changes that come with modernization affect, and they often affect them in negative ways. But at the same time, if you're I think what you said early on is kind of true, even from an equitable perspective. From the perspective of people's livelihoods, people's standards of living on a farm as a subsistence farmer you're generally pretty poor. There's not a lot of people that, you don't have a lot of material success. And, people tend to talk about this stuff as though people are getting forced off the farm, which, is true in some cases. There are people that are forced off there. But if you look at somewhere like China or India, people are mainly leaving basically voluntarily. There's market pressure, but they look at the people who are living in the cities, working outside of agriculture, and they're thinking, I want a better life. And that's the main driver of this stuff. I mean, on that level, there's a whole, as you said, there's a whole interconnection going on. Sets the parameters within this proceeds, but it's not as though peasants, subsistence farmers just want to be on their land, they want to farm, and people are forcing them off. A lot of people who do that stuff, especially in these countries we're talking about, India and China, they're really negative on it. Like, if you actually listen to what they say and don't just listen to, like, the food sovereignty people who, pull out people who agree with them, a lot of these people do not to keep living.
Yeah, I mean, it's not fun to live in sort of like isolated conditions with difficult work. But I mean, part of the problem is that, I mean, I think it's true that at the other end that I mean, this can end up sliding a bit towards the sweatshop kind of argument, where people say that within this matrix of existing conditions, this is the best option for them, instead of questioning the matrix of conditions that creates that outcome. Like, I think that that's part of the problem. Is that, I mean, that's why I made the joke about Mao too. Is that his whole thing was not. It wasn't against rural development. It was, I mean, it was kind of a very crude and problematic, but like still that kind of vision of, okay, we'll have development, but it'll be integrated into the community so that it won't be sort of these giant cities with rings of semi-homeless people kind of thing. Like I think that was kind of like, I think he saw the problems that were inherent in the kind of model that could have been taken up and
was taken up.
Yeah, and then I mean, to a large extent, it was taken up. I mean, I have read some interesting things about Chinese food system. That one of the reasons why it actually sort of boomed in the 80s and things was they actually raised food prices a lot, and that really helped create the market conditions for an increase in food production, and that kind of helped in other ways and things. So. And that was combined, obviously, with like sort of a major industrial, at first, firing of millions of people and stuff. So, but anyways, it's just an interesting kind of idea that, I mean, it was kind of funny because there was that attempt to kind of sell the Chinese changes as being a decentralization and small units and small farms producing more than big state farms and things like that. And so it to some extent that has to be true, and that's actually what did happen to some extent. But underneath that, there are economic causes that show that small scale is not necessarily as effective as a larger scale that was just better managed or something. So
I mean, I don't know, maybe this is naive on my part, but I do tend to think when it comes to things like the environment and management of resources and stuff like that there is something to be said for working on smaller scales, that centralization, it lends itself to higher risk kind of problems. Like you may end up electing to take some kind of policy that just brushes things with too broad strokes, and maybe it works here, doesn't work here, it's disastrous over there, and then you end up having you cause more problems than you actually tried to fix in the first place. And I don't know. I think there's plenty of examples of that.
Sure.
But, I think there's also the other side where you sort of need to centralize to some extent to maintain the productive capabilities that we need. So, it's limits on both sides.
I mean, what you're saying is exactly why people do, especially in the United States, they kind of spin this kind of, in this direction of, this kind of almost like village mentality of, the decentralized production somehow overall producing this better extreme kind of environmental outcome. The reason why they're doing that is a lot because of at least to some degree, is because there's very real or, real to ideological kind of spectrum of people who don't want to live in some sort of situation where the government just dictates everything, because they can imagine extreme changes to the economy in the direction of the environment that's just going to ruin their lives.
Right. It's a practical concern. It's not an ideological, I don't want the government to tell me what to do. It's like they can really screw it up. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's kind of like an underlying kind of thinking that's there, and they kind of have to contend with that. And I think that, and I also think that, to some extent that concern is extremely amplified by the corporate community, which is far to the right of probably what the average person believes on this kind of stuff. Really, I mean, I don't know. It's talking about the average person is always kind of difficult, but because it's just kind of a, what is
empty
that mean?
signifier?
Yeah. And but I mean, I do think that there's kind of like a common sense amongst people who are not directly invested in the more extreme kind of right-wing model of this, that they'd be willing to adjust in a lot of ways to potential needed changes, especially if they were more community-minded changes and not just kind of green austerity or something like that, And but that's politically impossible because of the way that the system is set up right now, where or at least it has been politically impossible, where the most you're really going to get is something like Obama's sort of like mild investment strategy. And in Canada, we do have like a sort of very rudimentary carbon tax and things like that. We've got a government that kind of talks about this stuff a lot, but is not really consistent on it. So I feel like that's probably near the limits of the system as it's going to produce on its own kind of thinking, without kind of this activist intervention. But as Alex says, like the intervention has to be rational in some ways to actually jive with people's common sense, I guess. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think that kind of goes into the article. Do you guys want to go through that? I think we can do it kind of quickly. We don't have to cover everything.
Yeah, go for it. Why don't you? Do you want to maybe summarize it for the listeners?
Yeah, or there's quite a few points, but yeah, I'll go ahead. This article is called "The Empty Radicalism of the Climate Apocalypse." It's by Ted Nordhaus, who's basically the founder of eco-modernism. He runs this thing called the Breakthrough Institute, which is, we kind of went over what that is before. And the article is about the extreme gulf between views of climate change as an existential threat to whatever you want, civilization, industrial civilization, and the measures that people actually call for. And it starts out with this vision of what you would actually need to fight climate change, what this stuff would be if it was actually real. And it's in the form of this hypothetical Jay Inslee campaign platform, which is basically about we're going to nationalize the power sector, we're going to nationalize the auto sector, we're going to introduce rationing, and we're going to, as fast as we can, immediately transit to all clean energy, much less of the stuff that emits a lot of carbon, like driving a car, instituting replacements for all of that stuff, like in transport you would have a lot more rail transport, and so on. And you can compare this to the real Jay Inslee platform, which I've read, which is, like we're going to have a carbon tax, we're going to we're going to end federal leasing for fossil fuel expansion, and it's much, much lower. And this stuff is just totally systemic if you're looking at the mainstream people. Like, I just have here something that Michael Mann said. Michael Mann is maybe the most prominent, at least in the media, climate scientist. And what he said was, we need a World War type mobilization. And that means putting in place incentives to move our economy as quickly as we can away from fossil fuels and renewable energy. And so what's the problem here? Well, let's think about World War type mobilization, okay? Is the way that when Hitler, launched the Blitzkrieg, did he put in place incentives to move his army as quickly as possible into Poland? Did Stalin put in place incentives to make sure nobody took one step back in Stalingrad? Did FDR put in place incentives to encourage innovation in the field of nuclear weapons? Not exactly. That's not quite how you would describe these. These were basically complete takeovers of the economy and society at large by the state and by the army. It wasn't setting incentives, and it wasn't bottom up. And I think that if you really want to have these kind of quick transitions that are going to get us to clean energy, what is the AOC thing? It's like we have 12 years. There's no way that the Green New Deal, as it's written, is going to do that. It's very similar to those mainstream views. And even if you want to do it by 2050, which I think is a more reasonable thing, I think that's more in line with the science of what we actually have to do. It's still not enough. It's not going to happen. That's not the way that the energy sector or the transportation sector is going right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know. I think that's it's true. But like, how do we get to the point? Is it just debating about it and stuff, or is there some force in society that would be better, suited to fighting for this kind of eco-modernist kind of proposal? Like, is it just that their ideas are wrong, or is there something in their interests that is forcing this bad ideological take or something like that? So,
well, as to the latter question, I think it's both. I think it's both bad ideology and bad interest. and, interests that are against. I think that most of the people who are interested in, on the ideological front, we can talk about that. But I also think that a lot of the people that are really concerned with the environment tend to be more well off. And I think this is pretty much borne out when you look at opinion. Once you're not really struggling very much, you already have a pretty nice job, it's a lot easier to be more concerned about the environment and climate change and so on. And actually, if you look at what happened during the Great Recession, you can actually look at the polls, and before the Great Recession, they asked people, what's more important, protecting our economy or protecting the environment? And before the recession, people say the environment. Yeah. Once the economy crashes, it flips. Like huge majorities are saying economy. And then, slowly as things get a bit better, it goes back. And I expect that's probably what's going to happen in, any future kind of thing where you would do like this program that he puts out where, you're rationing everything, you're having this real kind of mobilization. If that's really hitting people hard and you don't have anything to make them accept that, it's going to create a really big backlash. So going back to the other question you asked about, what could we actually do to convince people about this stuff? I don't know. Like, I mean, I'm not sure that there is anything. And I think that's really the problem that this article raises. I want to read a section from that, and we're skipping to the end here where he kind of sums up what the problem is. In a world where science and knowledge, actions and consequences are endlessly contestable, the sort of mobilization that many climate advocates call for is simply not possible. There will be no French-style centralized build-out of large, centralized nuclear power plants in the United States or most other parts of the world. Nor will the United States embark on a World War II-style mobilization to manufacture and deploy wind turbines, solar panels, and electric vehicles. The climate presidency I imagined earlier is fanciful not just because the events described are unlikely to either happen or be interpreted in the way that many environmentalists imagine, but also because there is little reason to believe at this point we are capable of arriving at or sustaining the sort of political consensus that such an undertaking would require. And moving on, the kind of changes that modernization brings basically undermine the kind of social solidarity and consensus planning that we need to do that kind of stuff. And this is a pretty pessimistic vision, but you kind of as your question implies, he may be right. It's not at all clear how we solve this stuff. It's not at all clear how we get to these actual programs that would really do it. We can state our views and try to convince people, but that may not work.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, even if they get convinced, what does that
mean? Yeah, there may be structural forces that are just going to prevent it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I always worry about. I mean, that's kind of one of the things that I still hold on to from Marxist kind of stuff is just not expecting opinions to be the thing that drive the change. Like, it's going to be, I mean, I guess, in theory, it would be that the negative results that kind of come about from these kind of environmental problems would eventually create some sort of constituency for change that's big enough to overwhelm the kind of structural corporate power. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's going to actually happen.
Well, I think to a certain extent it will.
Yeah. But
I mean, I think especially as you get towards mid-century and we start getting bigger effects, it's going to drive some more.
Yeah.
Maybe not this, but but the thing is, by the time it's mid-century, we're certainly going to be past 1.5C, and we're probably going to be past 2. I mean, if the current situation holds.
Sure.
So it's as I said, I'm not necessarily optimistic. I'm optimistic on some other things, but I am not optimistic on this political side, just because the way that he puts this, I think, is actually really interesting because it almost makes it seem like the system is rigged to prevent real change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true to some degree.
Yeah,
Like,
I would agree.
And and I think beyond that, I mean, I think the three of us probably agree too that when we talk about these kind of bad outcomes or whatever, we're not talking about some sort of final negative experience that just ends everything, as much as something that people will have to kind of suffer through, like they usually do, kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like it's more.
Yeah.
It's more of it's negative features of a future that will exist, but
Yeah, it's a crisis that will occur, and then people will, because they're not making preparations for it now, they'll have to deal with it when it hits. So the thing with climate change is that it's not, you can't just be like, oh, well, it sucks now, we got to change this, let's go fix the environment. Well, that's not how it works, right? So we'll just have to see what happens with that. I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Alex, so I have a question for you. I know that I don't know exactly what your political positions are or how you identify these days, but I know in the past, like myself and like Donald, that you have had sympathies for like a Marxist kind of a vision. So I am wondering, what do you think about a kind of Marxist strategy towards these problems? So, I think Marxists have always seen that the political problems of capitalism is needing a kind of top-down state-controlled action because the state is seen as such a powerful tool, whether it's in the hand of the bourgeoisie or the hand of the proletariat, so that it needs to be in the hands of the workers, right? So is that something that you think, is that a useful way to look at things? Is a possible strategy? And if so, like, how do we get to a position where we can actually implement it?
Well, yeah. Well, I would say one thing. I think that Marxists kind of have an ambivalent view of the state. I mean, that's definitely true. The whole goal of the Marxist revolution is a dictatorship of the proletariat. But at the same time, the goal of that revolution is to get rid of the state and basically to just have the economy work on its own without the need for a state. So it's kind of I think it's a really interesting view, that kind of view where you're having a political project that's supposed to end politics, basically. I think that's really the strength of Marxism, to be honest. That might sound weird, but the idea is to come up with this political project that forces you to get rid of the state, to get rid of politics, and just have a society that's basically rational, where the economy is rationalized and runs on its own. And
okay, I mean, I actually find that to be one of the fundamental problems with it.
You can I think it's a problem, and it is also a.
That's how you see it, right?
But I think it's also a strength. Maybe that's
how do you think that bears on the environment and climate change and whatnot?
Yeah, I think that that's probably the only way you're really going to get the kind of changes that environmental. But whether we can do it, well, you could take the old Marxist path, which is trying to make a dictatorship of the proletariat, but that doesn't seem very likely to happen in the next 30 years. I mean, you can, and how are you going to change that? Well, you can, I do like, I would say I'm still a Marxist, basically. Other people can make up their minds whether I am or not. I have some very unconventional views for a Marxist. But, for example, I'm a big fan of Frederick Jameson, and his idea is basically going back to more utopian ideas and hoping that can kind of catalyze the same kind of transition that happened. Whereas you come up with new ideas that are new futures, new stuff like that, and maybe you can have a new kind of synthesis, the same way that Marx took people like Saint Simon, although I guess he didn't really deal with Kant as much, but certainly Saint Simon and the Utopian Socialists, and tried to transform it into a political project.
No, I think that's an interesting way to put it, because I think that the people, like the Utopian Socialists, would be sort of like a major ideological similarity or, relationship with the kind of small scale eco socialist
Yeah.
production. Like that's where they're kind of, the sort of like mutualism things. And I mean, especially when you start to widen it a bit to more mainstream liberal, heavy environmentalist kind of stuff, like there's things like where towns will put out their own currency and that kind of thing,
Mhm.
like, are you saying that like these would be sort of ideas, or would they be like projects or something like that? Like, do you think that like there's actually things like, starting a community that models itself in this way, or is it just the ideas behind it that kind of drive the change or something?
Well, there are things that are kind of like that. There's this transition towns thing that's quite popular in the UK. I think it probably exists in the US too, but it's mainly in the
Mhm.
UK. I don't really see a lot of potential there. It is kind of wedded to that more decentralized vision that I'm not really certain has much potential. Jameson's idea is actually, it's much more central. He talks about the universal army and basically transforming the entire society into an army. And it's quite
Yeah.
out there. It's honestly, you read this stuff and it's not clear how serious he's being, but
Yeah.
That's a joke I used to make about how to make America socialist, is just to call every citizen, every citizen is automatically enlisted into the army, and then you're all deployed to different missions, which are jobs, and instead of like invading other countries, you're building things or maintaining bridges or whatever.
Yeah. He actually he borrows a joke from Eisenhower, where there was a debate about basically universal health care, and Eisenhower made a joke that was something like, well, if they want health care, then they can join the army. And he basically, pulls that out and saying, maybe we could really do that. Maybe that would work.
Yeah.
And, I think if you're going to reinvent a Marxist or socialist project for the 21st century, I think he may be right that you have to start with this kind of really out there stuff.
So you don't mean utopian in terms of specific
communes,
sort of projects or something. You mean more kind of big sky thinking kind of thing, like really. Yeah.
I'm specifically thinking of the utopian socialists of the 19th century. I mean, if you said that there was a kind of synergy between that and the decentralization stuff, well, if you look at I think Comte would be a very good example of a utopian socialist, and that was basically the opposite of his. His idea, you can kind of relate this to Habermas. Even, it's basically like enlightened scientists running society for the maximum rationalization.
Okay, so but the vehicle for change there would still be people would hear the idea and think it's good, and then adapt.
Well,
it
I think
into
that's
the
what we.
models or something?
I think that's what we can do right now. I don't see a lot of potential. I still agree with the basic idea that you're going to have base causes.
Yeah,
and you're going to have a political movement to really enact any change. But as far as what we can do right now, I really don't see the potential to do that. Maybe I'm just too pessimistic, or I don't have the right vision, but I don't see that happening.
No. I understand. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Just as an aside too about the sort of like mobilization and making everyone a soldier thing. So during the 60s, there was like one of the ways that the people that fought the draft, one of the ways that they their messaging, there was this stream of messaging, like anything on the left, there's different people taking different tacks and stuff. One of the major ones was, well, if we have a draft, we should use it for social purposes. Like, we should have young people, say, building houses in the ghettos and all that kind of stuff. That was kind of like the angle. And I always remember there's this book by this thing with Milton Friedman, and he had a debate with like a hippie guy or something. It was just one of those debates where they just set you up with someone just to punch them down, basically, or something like that. Apparently, like all the hippies and young people in the audience, whatever, hated Milton Friedman, except for one part he says, and that was kind of his like big triumphal moment or something, where the hippie guy says we should have a draft for the good things, like just kind of saying, we should have this kind of mobilization, but for social purposes, and people shouldn't be sent to go kill people. They should be sent to go help them or something like that. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. And then Milton Friedman's like, that is slavery or whatever, and like everyone's like, and he's like, he does like a, and then everyone clapped kind of moment or something, you know what I mean? Like, and he's like, we should have no draft. And then everyone was like, yay, no draft. And he's like, you see, the young people, they love libertarianism.
Yeah, I think that kind of cuts to the heart of the problem. I mean, people don't. The reason that it's so hard to solve these kind of problems, and I think a whole lot of others, is because people don't have a sense of solidarity with really anything. They're just kind of pursuing their own purposes, and they value their autonomy more than they value society.
Yeah. I find it. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Oh, I mean, it kind of reminds me what we said. I forget on what episode it was. It might have been the Mishima episode where we were talking about alienation and how people perceive society as like a hostile alien thing and not something that they have, like they're worried and scared of it and they want to stay away from any kind of collectivity because it just infringes on your liberties. It kind of forces you to do things. It coerces you. It tries to bombard you with these really hostile messages and make you feel bad. It's just a negative thing all around.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I do also think at the same time, I always worry when it's something, whenever you're kind of blaming the majority of people for something, like even if it's right to do that, I always kind of worry that there's some underlying wisdom to what's happening that is not evident to myself right away. Like kind of in that Maoist kind of way again of like trusting the people kind of thing. Like I always think that usually, I mean, it's one of those things that's hard because usually there is bad reasons for people doing things, like, but there's also tends to be some other combination of factors that once you understand that combination of factors, you're like, oh, that's why that's true, or something like that, So
I think that's definitely
kind of what
true.
I'm trying to point to is not exactly that people, it's not their fault that they're responding to a negative thing as if it's a negative thing, right? Like that's perfectly rational.
Sure. Yeah. Yep.
One thing I would point out, and maybe this can be an optimistic note, is that we're talking about centralization and decentralization, and I think what you just said puts it in a different frame, which is authority and liberty. And, you can have these hippies that are completely opposed to any sort of collective project for, the betterment of the collective. And I think that has become, the dominant frame of not only the left, but of society in general. Mm-hmm. But what I would say, to counter that, is that the working class was never as opposed to authority as hippies or the post-60s left ever. And, if you want to salvage Marxism, I don't really see a way to bring back that project or really any social without going back to, and it may be that there is a constituency for it. I think that right now the people that dominate politics are really not very class. They're, if you're talking about centrists, it's people that work in Silicon Valley, or if you're talking about liberals, people that work that are, certainly highly educated. They may not work in Silicon Valley, but they have a similar class background. And if you're talking about conservatives, it's like, the petty bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
People who, are small business owners. And there is a large number of people who still work very low-paying proletarian jobs. And there may be a way to get those people to, come back to a new political project. It's not really clear how you would do that, but I think that they would be, if at least if the past is any guide, they would be much more willing to do something. And so if we're talking about, not blaming people, just remember, it's not everyone.
Sure.
The majority of people are just politically disengaged. And the people that are really, when I criticize this kind of selfishness and obsession with autonomy, it's really, a fairly small amount of people who are fairly well off.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess, do you have any final thoughts that you want to end on before we get into the questions? We have a few questions that aren't exactly related to climate change and stuff, but more, I don't know, you'll see. They're kind of
Okay.
about, yeah, random things.
One thing I would say, yeah, here's basically what I'll end. We've been talking about how this is a really hard problem to solve, but we also shouldn't overestimate how much of a change is going to affect it. Like, you read all these articles, these headlines that say, like, the permafrost is melting, 50 years ahead of schedule, stuff like that. But we really shouldn't overestimate what this is really going to. Just as an example, the IPCC, if you look at the latest report, which is the one on 1.5 degrees of warming, they look at what might happen, and they cite this study, which says if by 2100 we have 1.66, which is well beyond where we want to be at below 2C or even, they say if we have that much warming, the economy is going to be 3%, in terms of GDP, it's going to be 3% lower than it would be. And what that means is, in between the 80 years between now and 2100, we're going to have, 2%, 5% growth every year. And that means the economy is going to be several times what it is. And the final figure will be a little. Now, what people who are very concerned with climate change will tell you, and I think they have a point, is that this may be, and indeed almost certainly is, a big under. There's a lot of non-linearities in the impacts of climate change, and it means that we could go well beyond figure. But let's say even if it's 10 times, it's not 3% lower, it could be 30% lower, you're still looking at a much larger. You're still looking at people, being richer than they are today. And I think that is really, this is not some outlier study. If you look at the economic studies on what climate change is going to do, it's almost always something like this. And when you listen to the climate discourse, they're basically saying that the world's going to end. If it's not the end of civilization, it's certainly going to be, a vast reversal of people's. Now, just to qualify that, the last thing I want people to think is that we shouldn't take climate change seriously, or it's not going to be that. But when you're talking about climate impact, the people that are going to suffer from it are really people that are already very poor. If you're living in Bangladesh, you're living in Sahel, then climate change really is an. But I just don't see the evidence that it's a threat for advanced countries, for people that are already very well off. The deciding factor for the fate of the United States, probably China, and so on, is really the economy, technology. It's not the climate. There are places all over the world where people don't have a very strong economy, they don't have a lot of technology, and those are the people that are going to face the consequences. So when we're talking about why we should solve this, it's not because you or me or Donald are personally going to die from it. It's because it's going to create a lot of problems for people that are very different from people who are very poor. Probably the way that this is going to get solved is that those people are going to have to get much richer. Their societies are going to have to improve industrially, they're going to have to move people out of agriculture, and they're going to have to find ways to adapt. And, that's the way that I think that's the framing considered. Not about the collapse of civilization, not even about the end of progress. I have a lot of reservations about it. But I think that we have to be realistic about what's going to happen.
All right, that's really interesting. That's gives me a lot to think about. Probably the listeners as well. You guys want to get into the questions now?
Sure,
Okay.
let's do it.
Okay, so let's see. Someone asked this back in the end of May. We want to know about hyperleftism. We want it to be real. Please answer sincerely as possible. So I think this is for you, Donald.
Okay, so hyperleftism is a theory that I came up with, which says that the revolution has already been achieved throughout time. So all other forms of leftism are partially revisionist. And also every state is partially revisionist, so that every state is also partially socialist. And that's throughout history. And that's kind of my hyper-Marxist insight. So the way that it works is that the revolution has been achieved in the future. And then I'm not sure how this works, maybe through time travel or something like that. They will go back in time and fix history so that communism will exist throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
And because this is theoretically possible, I think it already has happened. And
Yes,
and we just haven't experienced it, but it has happened to other people maybe. And anyways, the key insight though is that because I've kind of helped develop this theory, all other leftist organizations are subordinate to the hyper-leftist movement and should be taking orders from me. So I consider it, I call it socialist inversion. So socialist inversion means that any existing socialist organization in the world is now part of the hyper-leftist movement, whether it likes to or not. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and there's no way to dispute it.
Yeah, that's very compelling. Yeah,
Yeah.
I would actually posit that maybe the pharaohs achieved the revolution, and yeah, we're all kind of living in the shadow of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're all revisionists compared to Ramses.
Yeah, we need to bring back the pharaoh to kind of purify the state. Okay, yeah, that's cool. A lot of interesting ideas this episode.
Yeah.
All right, this one says, what do you guys make of the internet and now political tactic of accusing interlocutors of being, like, creepy or whatever for continuing to challenge or respond to you or whatever? This sort of weaponization of consent-type language reads as kind of bizarre or harmful to me, even though I guess I understand where it's coming from. Like, obviously the whole debate me cowards rhetoric is dumb, but to criticize it in a way that, I don't know, just seems icky and wanted to get the opinion of people who've witnessed lots of online arguments.
Yeah, I think I can answer that.
Yeah, go for it.
Most people don't like arguing, and that's really what all that comes down to. I mean, I really love arguing. I love talking about stuff, but you kind of got to respect people's boundaries. Like, you kind of got to learn, when people want to talk to you about something and when they don't. And that's really all there is to it.
Yeah, I think you have a point there. Although I do think there is something about the way that people frame things in terms of harassment or creepy or whatever that ends up that seems in bad faith to me. At least
no, yeah, it is in bad faith.
A large part of the time, not always, certainly, but yeah. In which case, I would say that people should sort of embrace what you're talking about. Just say, like, I don't really want to argue with that. You don't have to respond to everything. You don't even have to block people. A lot of people, especially who if they're celebrities or they just have a large presence online, they will talk about how, I had to block 100 people today. It's like they sent you one message. You probably are never going to get another message from them. Why was it necessary to even block somebody? You could just ignore them. You know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah.
People with like 20,000 followers talk about how their notifications are going on. Like I can't imagine having my notifications on, and I only have I have less than 2,000 followers. So
yeah. I could never put that on my phone where it starts beeping at me every time someone replies to my post.
Yeah.
Oh man, they really do that? They have that on? Oh my god.
Yeah, people actually put that on, and I'm like what the hell is wrong with you? Like,
when it gets liked, when it gets retweeted, when when people are having a conversation and you're just added to it,
Yeah. But I think, one of the things that I really don't like is this kind of, though. I mean, I get what they're saying, is that there is this kind of tendency. I think everyone does it. It's not really, a lot of people do it at least, is that people disagree with you because they're a bad person. Like, that's the basic internet idea. And if they disagree with you, then you kind of have to figure out why their personality's bad or something like that kind of thing.
Right.
So that if someone says something that they disagree with you on, then they kind of have to go all in pretty quickly and say, well, you're a creep for thinking that kind of thing, right? And then the thing with that though is, number one, it's often true. It's often like it's often true that people, if some guy's like got like 10 MAGA things in his profile and is like screaming about something weird or something like that, yeah, they probably are weird or something. Like it's not like,
yeah.
Sure. So I think that's fine. But the other thing that I've figured out recently though is that you can just completely bend backwards, and as long as you understand where the person's coming from for that kind of angle, like they want to be able to attack you, if you quickly I mean, this is just troll logic, this is not like helpful logic, but you can really quickly undermine them by agreeing too much quickly. Like you can kind of like, I don't know, I find this a lot, that like if you're debating something and you don't want to debate it anymore and you don't want them to go after you, you can just kind of quickly pivot to make it look like you've taken their side now. Mm-hmm. And what happens is it completely blows them away. Like you wouldn't even believe it, but they really immediately be like, oh my God, thank you for agreeing, kind of thing. I mean, it's not like, I don't know. I see that a lot now, that where all they want is the victory. So if you give them the victory, you can just walk away and they won't they'll stop bothering you. That's the thing. So yeah. I know it's very.
I do like that tactic. That works in real life for all kinds of things. If someone has like like some kind of petty authority over you, like a traffic cop or security guard or something, and you just make them feel like they have that power over you, like you just kind of give them that feeling. Then you get to like walk. They'll give you all kinds of privileges, or just kind of like let you do what you want or whatever.
Sure.
So yeah, sure. That's a very good.
Yeah, sure. So any other questions or?
Yeah. Let me just, I'm scrolling through the constant insults and accusations of the CIA and all that. Okay, here's a funny one. Let's say someone put a significant bounty on your asses. They want you dead. I contact you with an offer. Cut off an ear and provide it to me. I will then claim the kill and collect the big money reward, and you will have to go into hiding. I won't give you a share of the prize, but this will provide you a decent cover as you go underground and radio silent, and if this scam gets outed, I'm probably dead myself. So I'm taking on a lot of risk here. Do you accept my offer, or do you just lay low and go on the lam, hoping no one comes for you like Salman Rushdie?
Wow, that's that's elaborate.
Is that a threat?
Yeah. I don't know. I've got, my ears are pretty big, and I think I can, get by with one.
Yeah, the shipping alone isn't worth it.
Yeah, sure.
To mail it. Yeah, I would assume that whoever's coming after me is some sort of, I don't know, some crazed internet person with like 300 different disabilities or whatever, so I wouldn't be too concerned about them. Or it's like some kind of Russian or Chinese gangster that's coming after me and realize that I'm the head of police at the CIA and is taking me out, in which case, you live by the sword and die by the sword. So yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's do one more here. Any advice for someone who likes to argue living in a world of passive-aggressive people? That one sounds right up your alley, Alex.
Well, there's an infinite number of people that you can argue with. So if the people you're dealing with are passive-aggressive, just ignore them, Find somebody else. Like, there's Twitter, there's forums, there's all sorts of people that you can argue with. And if that's what you like to do, then there's just, you can do it for the rest of your life. Although you might want to reconsider that because, it often doesn't really go anywhere. I mean, it's fun. I think it's fun. But I rarely find that arguments are really that enlightening. I kind of used to have this view that, you test your ideas against people and, maybe you can even change someone's mind, come up with better arguments, you can come up with better justification. But I think that it very rarely works that way, and it can really just end up distorting your thinking. I mean, it's much better to study than it is to argue with people. And
Yeah.
and if you're going to argue with people, you should argue with people where you have a great deal of common ground, and that's the way that everyone is approaching the conversation, where we all kind of accept each other's views, at least it's coming from some sort of place that's worthy of respect. Whereas if you do that with people on the internet, I think that the main reason people will be dismissive or, rude is really, like I said before, they just think you're a bad person. Like, the only way somebody could disagree with me about politics or science or whatever it is because they have some sort of huge personality flaw or, are just completely irrational. And
yeah,
that's not very useful. You don't really progress that way. The main way that you're going to get anywhere is by studying, talking with people who, give you the benefit of.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. You need to find people who are sincere, and you need to be sincere yourself as well. I think if people can tell that you're arguing because you want to hear yourself talk or because you want to be aggressive or something like that, then they're going to get away from you as quickly as they can. But if you're talking with people like your friends who are of a similar mind, they want to kind of hash out some ideas or something, then you can disagree pretty strongly, and it's not going to be a bad experience for either party,
Yeah, I really think it would be good even if the people you're talking about, even if the people you're arguing with are kind of doing it in bad faith, or how did the questioner put it?
Passive aggressive
even if they're being passive aggressive, you like if you're talking with those kind of people, if you're going to get anything out of it, you should try to kind of cultivate yourself and figure out ways that you can get through to those people and try to come up with, inventive strategies like what Donald was talking about with, that's kind of, as he said, it is kind of troll logic, but, there's probably a lot of different ways that you can, maybe diffuse the situation.
Yeah.
Or, say something funny, try to build something out of it rather than, just butting heads, which is never going to lead anywhere.
I think you have to kind of look at it from the opposite angle too, where I think a lot of people online are not used to. I mean, to some degree I do get some of this, but they're not used to being in situations where they're the ones that can't decide whether or not they're arguing or not, kind of thing. Like they're not used to situations where they're at like work around a lot of people and there's people giving their opinions, and you know what I mean? I think a lot of people are very isolated in different ways, or they're only around people that completely agree with them about 90% of things all the time. And that really, really comes across when we're talking about like jokes and things like that, like where people react very strongly to certain types of jokes or things. You just tell that they're just not around a lot of different types of people a lot of the time because they just, it's things that are not extreme at all become across as extreme to them and things. And I think that's part of it. But yeah, I think that's something that is a skill is to learn, is to how to argue or how to talk in situations where you can't really leave. Like you got to be there for some reason, like a Thanksgiving dinner or something like that. And there's people giving you their opinions. So it's not like you're seeking it out. They're just kind of like, here's some opinions. And you're like, okay, well, and you kind of have to handle it kind of thing. I think in that situation, one of the best things you can do is instead of arguing directly with them, because that's just not going to, a lot of the time that just kind of goes nowhere. A lot of the times what you can do is choose a third topic in between, or like a second topic where it relates to the original topic, but it gives you a potential way of pretending that they were going to agree with you about something, which is like a secondary issue where it's against their ideological nature to do that. So that, anyways, I'll give an example. I know someone that hates unions and brings it up every time I meet them, and just has every story that from the internet about unions being terrible and stuff. And the way that I figured out how to handle it myself to like actually be able to be in that situation and not just get angry, and not get angry to the point where I'm saying dumb things or something, what I would say instead is I'd start talking about police unions. and they would get really kind of flustered, kind of a bit confused, because I'd be like, yeah, police unions are bad, kind of thing, and going into that kind of stuff. And it was kind of like, it's like a adjacent topic. It's like unions, but it's police. And so the conservative mind in that kind of thing goes, wait a minute, no, police are good, but unions are bad. So they start to kind of short circuit, and I think that can help. Yeah, if you cause them to short circuit, they can, because then they have to make a choice in their mind between two things they love, and it's like a Sophie's choice. So it's just what you want to do at every Thanksgiving. Yeah, so yeah,
that's pretty good.
I think it's interesting, what you said about often people aren't around anyone that really disagrees with them on a fundamental level. You also see this thing where people will talk about like what people are saying at work, like their coworkers are like MSNBC people and they're obsessed with and stuff. Talk about how these discussions that their coworkers are having rage, and I don't really like. I can sympathize with that. I probably would if I had to work those people, but maybe you should just learn to not like, oh, that's something people care about. I don't know. I don't really have a good solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think on some level you just have to. Who cares, right? As Big Dave would say.
Who cares? Sure. Okay.
All right. So thanks for coming on, Alex. It was a really good discussion. I really enjoyed hearing some of your ideas, and we also even got a little bit of trolling elite tips here at the end from Donald.
Yeah,
so.
okay.
Yeah. It was great being on. Thanks for having me on. I'd love to come back on sometime.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. The Twitter is at You Can't Win Pod. You can send us questions there to the Curious Cat, and we'll catch you next time.